as we speak. Okay. I think it's working now. So welcome on stream. You're live on TV. Just wanted first to say thank you before we start. I'm going to be a bit impolite and talk about myself, like if you don't mind. So I'm better able to introduce you right after that. But I'm Edward and I'm working for not so long actually for the FJSL, for some people who actually had the chance to participate to the contest in the previous years. We had the idea of like creating this kind of online events, like to be able to react to things happening in the news, big things, and not being always compelled to organize big events with big logistics, and so to have more reactivity. And very recently, it came out the third report from the Ipcc here, which is about mitigation. Just to give you a bit of context, Andrew came during the contest, the 51st contest of the National Jonk Fuerscher very recently, and made a keynote about how young scientists can actually help, like with these reports. And right after the actual contest, we had a small discussion, and I told him that I read the second report and partly the first, and that I was a bit sad about that reading. And he told me, yeah, but wait, you need to read the third one, which is right about to come out. So here you are, because I think there is nobody better than you two guys to be able to talk about it and why people need to read it. I read it yesterday and the day before, and I get better now. So I just give you just a few minutes so you can introduce yourself, guys, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Edouard, and thank you very much for organizing this event today. It's really a pleasure to have it actually the week right after the publication of the latest Ipcc report. So my name is Andrew Ferrone, and I'm the head of the Meteorological Service here in Luxembourg, which is associated to the Agricultural Ministry. And together with Dana, we are representing the government of Luxembourg at the Ipcc. And I'm also participating at the UNFCCC, so the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change process, where I'm actually heading a team of negotiators who then take the scientific messages that come out mainly of the Ipcc into the political process. So that's my my main task. And Dana, do you want to introduce yourself?
Please.
Yes, hello. My name is Dana. I'm working together with Andrew, and I started like 3 months ago, but I also represented Luxembourg for the first Ipcc, for the first working group. So now it's my third time that I'm helping Andrew with the Ipcc, but it's my first live interview. But yes.
So it's a first for us two at least. Andrew has been working in front of a lot of people already, so we'll deal with that then. I think we'll get through that. Can you tell me a bit more about what does it actually mean to be representative for Luxembourg in terms of Ipcc? What do you have to do, and what's your...
Yeah, so the Ipcc consists, I would say, of two main parts. On the one side, we have the scientists who are actually writing the report. But then, as the name suggests, it's an intergovernmental panel on climate change. There are also the governments represented. And so Dana and myself, we are the representative for Luxembourg. Our role, first of all, is to participate in the review process. So once the scientists have written a first draft of the report, this is sent to both expert review, but also to governments, and then we can comment on the draft, and the scientists have to reply to these comments. And then afterwards, the whole comes into an Ipcc plenary where all the governments are represented as well as the scientists are present. And then, now as it was in full virtual format, it was going over 2 weeks, and it was a really exhausting process. We went to the so-called summary for policymakers. So that's the summary of the real summary, we went to it line by line, and we need to find consensus between the governments and the scientists on every single word, I would say, or at least on every single sentence in there. So each of the sentences of the 65 pages of the latest SPM, we had to find consensus on it, which really was very, very tiring.
Okay, just for the people to understand, when you talk about making comments and reviewing all comments, I think I read somewhere that the amount of comments is like several thousands of comments about absolutely everything, basically, and you need to review them all and then accept them or reject them, but also give an explanation why you accepted them and rejected them, right?
Yes, that's correct. I don't have the exact number of the last one with me, but it was around 40,000 comments over the
I read 60
period.
plus somewhere.
And
so
yeah, it was a very high numbers, and actually they will be public afterwards, the written comments, so everybody can have a look at them on the Ipcc website and also see how the authors reply to them.
Okay, and there is another question about the Ipcc report. I'm going to let's start first. We are the third report here. Like, this is the publication of the third report. Can you tell us, like, briefly, what are the first and the second one about? Like, I know that, but like many people might not know what like the content of this report was about.
Yeah, so the Ipcc works as 3 working groups. The first working group is about the scientific basis of the climate change. So basically, the main question is climate changing, and what's the cause for it change? The second working group is about the adaptation of climate change and the vulnerabilities to climate change. We know that climate change is happening, and we know that it has consequences. How vulnerable are we to these consequences, and how can we adapt to them? So a part of the solution space is addressed there for the adaptation part. And then we have the working group 3, which is the latest report, which talks about the mitigation of climate change. So we know that climate change is unequivocally caused by by emissions from humans of greenhouse gases. And so the question is now, how can we lower our emissions? And what are the implications for it for society, also financial implications, and so on. So that's the real solution space in order to limit climate change to 1.5 or 2 degrees.
Okay, the tasks seem daunting, but as you mentioned during the keynote, like, you're looking obviously for young scientists. You're also looking for more young females at best to be able to equilibrate. I'm just going to address Dana in terms of so you've not been working for so long with this task, so it's something new for you. How I would be afraid actually of the task. Like, it looks like a gigantic wall of things to apprehend and stuff. How do you actually apprehend that?
I think it's a big chance to participate, but if you're looking at the participants, they're older than me because I'm very young and I'm a female, so it's a lot of pressure if you participate, but it's a big chance to negotiate with other countries and to see other views. So I'm really happy that I have the chance to participate. And yes, that's...
Okay, so we have some questions already showing up on the chat. I'm just like I take note of your questions, and I'll just come back a tiny bit later. We just need to set up the base, so don't worry. We'll come back to your question. Yeah, so yeah, it looks like a wall of things to do, and something also I would like to come again like later would be. So this is scientific work. I'm just going to give you my idea of what the report is, because like I'm outside of it. Like, I had the chance or the opportunity to read it, and at first I thought like, oh my God, what am I going to do here? It's like going to be completely incomprehensible, and in some way it is. But I would suggest everyone who is interested in that, like, to at least check for the policy maker's summary, because this is like quite easy to read, but it's written in a very, very particular way. And just before people just jumping and think that they are going to read a novel about like, people have in mind this Al Gore movie, very dramatic and stuff. And this has absolutely nothing to do with that. It talks about the same thing, but it has nothing to do. So can you explain the tone of the reports? And like you said, something about approval before. At the top of each page, it's written approved in big and in bold. Can you tell us a bit more about this exact process and what should people expect when they read at least the policymakers? Because this is kind of the summary of it, if I understood well.
Yeah, well, actually, the summary for policymakers is the part of the report that is approved line by line in the plenary. Actually, the rest of the report is really written by the scientists. And so this is just adopted by the IPCC as a whole. So the governments are actually not intervening there, so to say. The way you have to imagine the approval process is, I like to talk about a dialogue between the authors, the scientists, and the government representatives like Dana and Mia. Actually, it's not the governments who are writing the reports, but it's always the scientists who are writing the reports. That's very important to understand because it is a scientific report. However, the governments are there to first see that all the topics are covered that are policy relevant without being policy prescriptive. So it's important that the IPCC is not recommending something or is not imposing something to any government. So it's policy neutral. Every government has to decide themselves based on the report. Hopefully, at least that's what we are pushing for, based on the report, make decisions, but not that the IPCC imposes these decisions. And then the governments are also there that it's written in a language that can be understood and used by policymakers in the political process. That's why some of the phrases, I agree, are maybe more difficult to understand than others. But that's because they are using sort of a similar or the same language as the one that is used in the political process. But that's important later on to be able to make both decision on it.
This is my tip for anyone trying to read it now. If you're interested, like you would read probably the bold titles, like all those B, C, D sections. Then you can dig into the footnotes. I suggest to read one or two to understand how does it work, why there are footnotes and what do they say. But then you can technically skip them. You know, it's just like if you want to know more about like what's going on behind, then you can read the footnotes. But it's way much easier to read if you skip the footnotes. And you still are going to get the content. I would have another question before we dig into our viewers' question. It's like so the report is created, related by scientists, but like when we say scientists, people always imagine like people with the white gloves in laboratory and stuff. But the report is pretty clear that it's not only about like water analysis or glacier ice stuff or chemicals, and it's also about economics, finance, social work. There is also a bit of psychology in there. Like it embraces absolutely everything. Now the question is, when you write such a report, how do you manage to first gather such a broad amount of fields? And second thing is, like, since the IPCC is like organized by United Nations, like, what is the role of states? Can they actually come in the reports and analyze that and say, okay, this we don't want it in a report, and then like completely screw your whole work? How does that work? This conflict.
Yeah, so first of all, for the selection of scientists, this is done on the proposition of governments again. So when the new cycle starts, first there is the Bureau of the IPCC, which is elected. So there is the chair of the IPCC that is elected. Then for each working groups, there are two co-chairs which are elected. And then both for the IPCC and the working groups, there are also vice chairs who are elected. So that's the first step. And usually it is tried first to have, of course, all the regions represented. We have to have a region and a global representation of countries in there. But also it's important to have to try to have all scientific knowledges already represented in the report. That's another important criteria. And then once the bureau is in place, actually the panel, so it's again the scientists together with the governments, they decide on they do a scoping of the report, so they decide on the content of the report. This is very broad scoping. It's not going into the details, but just that actually governments tell the scientists, well, these are the topics that we are actually interested in and that we want to have information on. That's the next step. And then based on this scoping, the bureau actually selects based on a nomination by the governments. They select the authors that are going to write the report, and this is then based on their CV. So the CV is really important. Of course, also here the regional representation is extremely important, because it's clear that especially when we go into the solution space, that not all solutions can be applied everywhere in the world. I mean, this is very clear, and so it's important to have scientists from the different regions so that they can say, oh, this solution might be working perfectly, let's say, for example, in the developed countries, but for developing countries, it will be very challenging to implement it. So that this kind of discussions is also happening. And that's the selection process of the authors is indeed a very crucial step in writing the report.
There is no risk, for example, that a country who would have a completely different political agenda would actually come on top and say, okay, veto, and then buy, or?
Well, the risk exists as it is by consensus. The risks exist. Well, I have to say that in practice, it's very difficult, because there would then be many other countries coming in to defend the work on the authors. That's, at least I can say for Luxembourg, always the first priority, that we defend the work on the authors. They have to have the final word. It's not the government dictating the author what to write, but it's the authors proposing, and then the government can agree or not to it. But it's always important. And I mean, if we are in the risk of losing some information that we would really see as important, we would come in to support the authors and to have this information into the SPM. So yes, in theory, the risk exists, but I think in practice, it doesn't really materialize.
Okay, and so Andrew, you've been there for quite a while now. Dana, you're new to it. How do you feel about like your voice being heard in that whole gigantic process? Do you feel that your voice is being heard and that you play an important part, or does it still feel like you're a tiny piece of like something gigantic, or like where's the balance for you in there?
I think for the IPCC, it doesn't matter if you're new or if you're really started like years ago, because you're heard the same. Because every time I said something, everyone respected the opinion and I got a response to it. So I don't think that you're treated differently if you're just starting. But it's true that it's more difficult if you start, because you have to learn the whole process, you have to learn all the abbreviations, and it's difficult to start, but I think you're treated the same. For them, it doesn't matter if you just started or not.
Okay, sounds reassuring at least. Because this could be a crushing machine. That's what I would be afraid, but I have the feeling that it's not after reading the reports and then hearing about the whole process. So I just wanted to make clear that people understand that it's not like a huge political agenda and then pushing things, and it's nothing to do with that. I really encourage you to read the reports. So as I said, I read the report yesterday and like during the whole week actually, but what struck me is, like, as I said, like you have like it's breakdown into different categories about like the energy, like where do we waste things, like what can we do better, and then it moves on. And the more you read that, the more you actually realize that there is actually a solution. And then despite the urgency, and I'm going to stress that word, the urgency, it's still doable, and it's not like a note of optimism, but it's a scientific fact that we still can do something. And this is something extremely important that comes out through the report and shines pretty clear. It's like, scientifically speaking, we know for sure that we messed up, that it's our fault, that it's going the wrong way. We are sure of that. We are sure of, we know what's going to happen if we continue that way, but we are also sure that it's not too late if we act now and a bit drastically, but it's not desperate. It's not like we are going to turn the whole world upside down. The solutions are kind of already there, and we are not relying on a technology that will come in maybe 50 years times with a maybe, but it's actually there and we can do something. Can you tell us a bit more about that? Because like this is really an optimistic note, but that should be balanced with the fact that the urgency is present.
Yeah, no, I fully agree with you. I mean, especially the Working Group 1 and even more the Working Group 2 report stressed the urgency. I mean, they both said that if we are not reacting within the next years, 5 years, I would say, big maximum, we are going to exceed the 1.5 degrees target. And if we go beyond the 1.5 degrees target, the Working Group 2 report clearly showed that there are changes happening that cannot be undone. So even if we wait for thousands of years, even for temperatures to come down, there are changes that we cannot undo. Ecosystems can collapse. The ice sheets could be triggered to completely melt. For example, the Greenland ice sheet, if we go above 1.5 degrees, we could reach the point where it would completely melt, which would have an impact on sea level rise of more than 7 meters of rise. This would, of course, happen over thousands of years, but it would happen whatever we do afterwards. So indeed, there is a big need of urgent action. However, as you said also correctly, the Working Group 3 reports really shows very clearly the solution space. And also there it is very interesting to see that basically all solutions are already available, especially the renewable energy, which will play a big part if countries decide to go into that direction. And for example, the prices of renewable energies of both photovoltaics and wind energy are now on a level that are completely competitive or even cheaper than fossil energies. And the report also clearly shows that the whole energy sector can actually be based on renewable energies only. So we don't need other sources, of course, together with batteries to store the energy, because we know that they are intermittent, but it is possible to go that way. And indeed, there is, at least in my point of view, a clear view of hope, of possibilities to still limit warming to 1.5 degrees, at least at the end of the centuries. But emissions have to go down drastically to do this. Greenhouse gas emissions have to drop by 43% in 2030, and CO2 emissions have to come to a net zero, as it's called in English, around 2050. Net zero means that all the remaining anthropogenic emissions of CO2 have to be balanced by sinks of CO2. This can be, for example, biological sinks like forests, like other grassland or so on, which need to be increased in order to balance these emissions.
Okay, so I'm going to take one of the question that's just like printed on screen here, which is directly related. So you say that we basically, and the report says that if we want to stay under this like 1.5 degree targets, 2 at worst, if I understand that, like it makes, like the report makes the distinction always between like not taking care and continuing like as we do, 2 degrees, 1.5 degrees. And so if we want to reach this like 1.5 maximum, then we will need to reduce the CO2 emissions by 2 by 2030 and going to 0 by 2050. Sounds impossible to me, although the report says it's doable. So the question is there any good reason to remain optimistic?
Well, yeah, I think that there is actually, because we see also the report, although the report says that the emissions have grown over the last 10 years, actually they have grown less fast than the previous 10 years. So we see a slowdown of the growth of the emissions. As I said, they are still growing, so they are going into the wrong direction still. That's a not so good message. However, they are growing less fast, and the report also clearly shows that some of the decisions that have been taken, especially in the UNFCCC, but also on national level, actually contributed to this slowdown of growth of emissions. And it's actually saying that with the policies that are currently in place already, so that are inscribed in the law, the emissions actually would sort of level up over the next years and then slowly go down or remain at that level, which is clearly not sufficient to reach neither the 1.5 nor the 2 degrees. We would be on the track for 3 degrees or 3.2 degrees. That's what the report says exactly. So we would clearly fail on the 2 and 1.5 degrees with the current policies in place. Nevertheless, they had an impact, and that's what important to understand. So that shows that we have actually understood how to go into the direction, but of course the ambition has to be increased a lot in order to reach still, especially the 1.5 degree.
Okay, I have a question here, and it joins another question I received earlier via Instagram. It's basically the same question, so I'm going to use the one in the chat here. It's like, do you believe that the access to environmental friendly alternatives to energy sources been restricted in some countries, restricted from contributing to reduce climate change? So the question, basically, if I understand it well, is like, when you think about reducing emissions, then you tend to think about like rich countries versus poor countries or developing countries. And then you would say, okay, fine, but we want to reduce emissions, but those guys, maybe they need that, in order to grow. And the report states clearly, I think if I'm right, it would be in section B3 or something like that, that there is a high difference between rich and poor countries, of course, but the growth can be achieved without significant global emission growth with high confidence. So it means that actually we are taking care of everyone in this scenario, right?
Yeah, actually, well, let's first start with this point, because both the Working Group 3 report as well as also the Working Group 2 report looked at climate resilient development. So this is more than climate change. This also includes the other sustainable development goals. So, for example, the reduction of poverty globally, also the access to food for everybody, and so on. So there are different sustainable development goals, and both reports says that without stringent mitigation action, but also adaptation action to climate change, they are actually getting out of reach. So if we don't act very fast on climate change, these sustainable development goals cannot be reached anymore. And a clear example is if we go above 2 degrees of global warming towards the end of the centuries, the food system as we know it today might collapse, which of course would then be impossible to reach the zero hunger sustainable development goal. That's just one example, one possible example. But also, as you said, it means that even if developing countries go into the direction of renewable energy, they can still reach actually their sustainable development goals. That's what Working Group 3 also clearly says. However, Working Group 3 also says that we need to increase the finance for it, both in developed countries. So in developed countries, the finance towards mitigation of climate change is not high enough, but obviously also in developing countries, it's not high enough. And of course, in the political process, there is also a discussion, for example, under the Paris Agreement, of transferring a certain finance from developed to developing countries, which then is something to discussion to have in the political process.
This is something which is actually detailed in the third report. It's like I didn't think I would find such high level of detail in terms of what can we do. I thought like, okay, it's urgent, but we are not here to help you. You have to take the decisions. But actually, no, it provides with solutions. And one of the stressed points is that the financial system can actually nowadays sustain this transition and finance it. It's just a matter of redirections and like policy making, of course, but like it's not something that would be stressful for the financial system. It's just a matter of choices now, right?
Yes, it is indeed, because the report clearly says that the financial resources are available to do the transition towards renewable energies, for example, both in developed and developing countries, but that the finance fluxes as they exist today are not high enough. They need to be increased in both parts of the world. They need to be strongly increased by a factor 3 to 6 in order to be able to achieve the 1.5 degree goal.
But the system has technically the capability to sustain such stress, right?
Yes, well, one part of the solution is the technical part of the solution. I mean, as I said previously, there is the renewable energies which can be increased, which is part of the technical solution. But we cannot achieve this goals without also lifestyle changes. So that's also important. That's something that has been assessed for the first time by the Ipcc. It's really the first time that we have looked at this, and the demand side option actually can achieve 40 to 70% of the emission reductions that are needed in 2050 just from the demand side options. So that's a very, very important message that actually we need both in order to achieve the very ambitious targets that are set out in order to achieve the 1.5 degree.
Okay, I would have a question for Dana now. It's related to, again, your work and your position in terms of like being in Luxembourg. This is related to a question that we received here. It's can we as individuals do something about it, because we're talking about finance now, we are talking about technology, we are talking about, like, in a broader term, like if you read the report, you tend to see that most of the waste or like what's done wrong is by industries, by transportation and this kind of thing. So if you had to address people in Luxembourg, and like people are asking themselves, what can I do as an individual, like in order to go in the right direction, what would be your what would you recommend actually?
I think as individuals, we can all do something, even small things.
Do you think it's not it sounds silly, but like if you look at the report, like the portion of like what individuals are in the end responsible for in like compared to industries and stuff, it looks like, oh, it's not nothing, clearly not. Like you can see that there is a big part, but it's like compared to it, it's so you would tend to think, okay, but like why should I, like maybe I take the plane a bit less and that should be okay, right? No?
But the problem is, if everyone thinks it doesn't change if I do something, then nobody will do something and then nothing changes. I think it's important that people know that even if it's just one person, we can still do something, even if it's small things like instead of taking the car to go to work, you can use public transports.
Mm-hmm.
Or if you build your house, you can use solar panels on your roof. And there are really a lot of things that can change, like because if you take the sector of buildings, you can see there's a lot of emissions, and you can use solar panels or use other materials which are more environment friendly.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if everyone would change the transport, for example, which is not possible because a lot of people are really dependent on the car, but even if some people really change and use public transport, it will make a difference.
Okay, so do you think like people in Luxembourg would still have a weight in that? It's like
I think it has changed a bit with the tramway, because you see that more people are using the tramway because it's easier to use the public transport than to go into villages and cities with the car, because there are no parking spots. So maybe it's easier to use public transport, which will change a lot because the transport is a huge sector for the emissions. So I think in Luxembourg it would be possible, but there is room for improvement.
there is also one thing that came out from my reading was the reports also in the abstract for policymakers, for example, goes so far to suggests, for example, to reduce the temperature when you're heating your whole building of 1 degree, which doesn't sound so much, but actually makes a huge difference. Or, for example, not heating the building when nobody's working there on a Sunday or on a bank holiday. And, for example, this is something that could be easily done in Luxembourg, right?
Yes, there are things that can be easily done. Also, like the solar panels, because nowadays they are cheaper than they were like some years before. There are really a lot of alternatives that can be done, but you have to have the will to do something, and people have to know about the possibilities. Maybe not everyone knows that they can install like solar panel on their roof.
And I think you're making a really important point here. It's so many solutions are actually easy and really approachable. It's not like something like so hard that you will need to do a huge effort, but you need to know about it. And that's partly why we suggest highly to read the report, actually, right? How far did that change your vision of the thing? Like, did you learn a lot, because you're working in the field, but like reading the report, did you learn a lot about what was possible and what's not? And
well, I did study geography, and I did my I don't know how it's called, my thesis on exactly this subject. But I was looking more into villages and which alternatives you have in the villages, in the cities, because it's different than the cities are different because they are hotter and there are other aspects of this. But I was surprised how much you can do, because I didn't know all the alternatives, even if I studied it at university. But there are really a lot of things you can do, and I think that if you didn't read the report, maybe you don't know about them all, because even me, when I studied it, I was really looking at the alternatives, but I didn't find everything about it. Now you have them all together in one report, and you have views from different countries and how they can work for them. So it's really interesting to read the report about the alternatives and to learn about them.
Okay. I'm going to kind of switch to another question which was raised in the chat and that we received on Instagram as well. I'm going to try to put it here. I don't know if you can see it, but like someone asked, should the responsibility be borne by industries and political power as much as by individual? And in the chat, someone asks about like politics decisions and like basically forcing people through laws like to act. And what's your view about it? Because again, if you look at the figures, then you tend to realize that the individual part is like technically much smaller than the industry part. And so like, should the responsibility be borne by industries and political, or by individuals, or as much on both sides, in your opinion?
Well, actually, the report is quite clear on this. We cannot achieve the most ambitious target if not all sectors. So that means the industry, but also individuals are reducing their emissions quite drastically. So there is no, as it's called often in English, silver bullet to change the climate change. For example, say, okay, we just address the transport sector and then the solution is done. So we really need to address all sectors. And as I said also previously, it's really important, and that's new in this report, that we also look at the demand side options, because this very strong this very strong reductions in emission cannot be achieved only by technological options, but they can also not only be achieved by demand side, so individual choices. So we actually need both.
That's societal change. And does it mean that at some point we might have to get politics to force people to do things?
Well, that's a political question. Clearly, it's difficult for scientists to answer. The report clearly says that it is important to have a strong a strong regulatory framework in order to achieve it. This can be in the form of more stringent restrictions, but this can also be in the form of just saying to, improving access to something. So, for example, in form of, like it's in Luxembourg here, for example, that we subsidize electric cars, for example, which can be also part of the solution, or make public transport for free, as we have it here in Luxembourg. That's part of the solution. But on the other side, it will also at some point there will be also restrictions that are needed on certain points. I mean, for industry, they are already on place. There are norms on place that you can only have a certain amount of CO2 which is emitted in the process, and so on. So in the end, in my opinion, it will be a mix of both.
Okay, Dana, your take on that?
Yeah, I think it's the same. You have really the both sides have to do something.
Okay, so we might have to be forced at some point, if I understand well, right? Because this is, I'm pushing on that point, because this is usually the main concern of people. It's like, yeah, but they are touching my liberty and these kind of things. You know how deep that can go with some people, and that's, to me, it's a bit critical actually, and that's why I'm pushing a bit in that direction as well.
Well, I think the report also shows that at least in the first step can actually be taken a lot by technological options.
Mm-hmm.
As we said previously, there are now many technological options out there which are economically viable and which can reduce fossil fuel use quite a long. Obviously, the societal choices, they need a bit longer, but it's. I wouldn't say that at some point you need really to force people. I mean, if you look already now at fuel prices, which are rising due to a very different topic than climate change, we all know it for the moment. Actually, people are getting more aware of it, and you can actually see that the usage of cars and people are informing themselves, how can I be more efficient with my car? Even if I have to drive it, how can I drive in the most efficient way? So efficiency is also a very important part of the mix. Also in the housing sector, there are lots of questions asked for the moment. How can I be more efficient? You raised the question of reducing heating inside by 1 degree or maybe 2 degrees. This can have a huge impact on your bill. So all these kind of things, although people are not forced per se to do it, actually just the fact that they have to pay the right price, if we can call it like this, because for the moment the problem with fossil fuel is that the price that we are paying of the consequences of burning fossil fuels is actually not included in it. So it is for free, and that's one of the options that can be considered in order to get the right prices on the fossil fuels.
Mm-hmm. And we're always talking about fossil fuels like energy, CO2, glasshouse effect, greenhouse gases. Sorry,
Yes.
To anyone interested in those questions and why we know it has an impact, I would revert to the first and the second report. Although there was like one question in the chat, I'm just going to take it and put it on the screen here, is that discourse around reducing our emission often centers around our CO2 emissions. What about other emissions like methane emissions, animal agriculture? Should political measures focus more on them as well?
Yeah, so from a purely purely physical point of view, actually, what we need to do in order to stabilize the temperatures is that CO2 emissions have to reach net zero. So as I said, the emissions that remain have to be compensated by sink. So as soon as this point is reached, actually, Working Group 1 says temperatures are going to stabilize. What is important, especially for methane emissions, but also other greenhouse gas emissions, is that we try to reduce them in the near future quite a lot in order to avoid a too rapid increase in temperatures, because there are two parts on how especially ecosystem can adopt. The one is the temperature threshold, which is important, but also the rapidity at which we reach it. The more rapidly we reach it, the more difficult it will be both for humans and for nature to adopt to it. And that's where methane emissions are indeed very important, and they are pointed out both in the Working Group 1 and in the Working Group 3 report. It is, however, also important to understand that approximately one third of the global methane emissions are actually coming from the fossil fuel sector. So they are not coming out of agriculture, but they are coming of the fossil fuel sector, in particular the leaks that are happening when natural gas is transported. And the Working Group 3 report also says that they could be fixed. These leaks could be fixed at relatively moderate costs. And these kind of emissions can be very rapidly reduced. Obviously, agriculture, it is much more difficult to reduce these emissions because they are part of the process. As soon as just to make an easy example, as soon as a cow is, of course, just living, it emits methane emissions. However, the report also clearly points out that also on the food sector, demand choices are important and can reduce substantially the greenhouse gas emissions. So switching to more healthy foods which contain less meat are actually also an option to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, in this case especially the methane, but also the N2O emissions, which are also coming from the agriculture.
I'm sorry, I'm jumping from one question to the other, but that's the informal aspect of the meeting here. But sure. I received in the meantime one question saying but 1.5 doesn't sound so much. If you allow me, I will answer with a picture that I recently, I think I told you about. It's you don't need to think in terms of being on a terrace and drinking your glass with 20 degrees or 21.5 degrees, but being sick with 39 and 40.5. And that would be a more adequate image, or tell me if I'm right.
Yeah, that's a very good way to put it. We can also put it a bit into the context of climate change. We know, of course, that there is also climate is also changing on a natural basis. We have, in particularly, the astronomical cycle, the Milankovitch cycle. We know that we had ice ages in the past.
Yeah, we had many extinctions in the history of the planet, and why would here that be different? I'm playing devil's advocate here.
No, you're absolutely right. That's an absolute valid question, and I can give an answer to it. But so just to say, for example, if we go to the last ice age, we all know that the Earth was very different than today. For example, Norway was completely covered in ice sheets. Just to take something which is not too far away, we know that the fjords in Norway, they're actually created by this ice sheet, by the retreat of these ice sheets. And in fact, at that point in time, the global temperature was only 5 degrees lower than today. So you see, 5 degrees makes the difference between an ice age and our present or our pre-industrial climate, which doesn't sound like a lot, 5 degrees, but it is actually a completely different climate. And we all know that our present culture based on agriculture and so on would not be possible during an ice age. So this really shows that, well, although it's 5 degrees, it's much more than 1.5 degrees, but still 5 degrees are a lot. And we have to say that before the Paris Agreement, actually, we were on the track to go for plus 5 degrees, plus 5 or plus 4 degrees. We were rather on that track. So now we are a bit down, which is a little bit of positive news. We are not far down a bit, but it's a bit of positive news. And actually, this shows that we were on a very in a very bad way there. And also to answer your question, we always have extinctions. Well, also we need to see how fast temperatures are rising. If we came out of the last last ice age, actually temperatures over the last 150 years have risen at a rate that is 10 times as fast as the fastest rate of change as we came out of the time. So we really have a factor of 10. So it's both the magnitude, the reason, because it's now unequivocal that it's due to anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases, and the change of rate that is completely different than the natural changes in climate that we always had.
I want to stress that and make clear that if we are here today and in such good living conditions, it's majorly because of the development of agriculture like 12,000 years ago. And that the development of agriculture was possible because the climate was stable. And if you read the report, basically it says, it clearly states that if you go above like this 2-degree barrier, then like the conditions for current agriculture would not be possible anymore. And therefore, like the consequences, even though we have technologies and stuff like that, shouldn't be, like I don't want to sound super, but it's not being pessimistic, it's being realistic, actually.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. The Working Group 2 report clearly states that above 2 degrees, the food system as we know it today could collapse. And that would, of course, mean that, I would say any kind of sustainable development goals can clearly not be reached in this scenario.
Okay. I would have a few last questions, and it's a bit getting a bit more personal now. As the first one, not so, but because you mentioned it already in your keynote, but it's about the part of, and it's someone else does that actually on the Instagram. It was about the part of female scientists, like in the redaction of the reports. So I would have your opinion both on, and not your opinion, but like, can you explain why is it so important? Actually, it sounds like logical that we should have an equal part, but like, what's the status now, and where does it go, and why is it important to have like equality here and there?
I think the number of female authors has risen over time, but we are not at 15%, so it's not equal. But if you look at the numbers, for example, for all the 3 working groups combined, we went from 8% to 33%, which is not a lot, but at least it has increased. And the working group 1 is the working group with the least female authors. I think there's like 27% that are female.
Reason why?
Sorry?
Any reason why?
Well, I think it depends on the science actually, because the Working Group 2 report, it's a lot in biology, geography, and so on. And often when students are being oriented, it's the female students are often oriented towards these sciences actually, if they go into sciences at all. And that's the reason, whereas in the Working Group 1, it's much more the physical science. There are lots of physicists in there, and that's a bit the background why it is more difficult to find excellent, because we need the most excellent scientists, of course, in the Ipcc, and it's difficult to find excellent female scientists for Working Group 1 and Working Group 3, and Working Group 3, it's more economics, obviously. There, it's also a field that is maybe not so attractive for female, and that's why actually it's very important at a very early stage to create to motivate young female scientists to go into these topics, and also to give them all the opportunities later on in their career to pursue their career.
Okay, so I'm going to ask again Dana and her excellent skills, therefore. Do you see that, is there, in your opinion, any difference in having like more women than men or more men than women in the redaction of such a report?
I think it doesn't really matter if you're female or male because you have the same competences. It doesn't depend on your gender, but I think maybe if you're female and you see that there's not enough female authors, maybe it's not encouraging, and maybe you think you don't have the chance to. But if you intervene in the process, you see that it really doesn't make a difference. If you speak, you're heard no matter what gender you are, and you really see that everyone's listening. So for me, it doesn't make a difference. But I think it would be nice if you had more females participating. But even if you participate for the approval session, you don't really see the difference because there are a lot of females women that are intervening. So in the approval session, for me personally, I don't see the difference because there's a lot of women with valid points and the others listen to them. And for me, it's more or less balanced in the approval session.
Would I have this to do maybe with role models and the possibility to have like someone to like do you have role models, for example, within the Ipcc panel, which are female and not male, for instance?
In the Ipcc, yeah, I really liked a delegate from Canada,
Okay.
Elizabeth Bush. I really liked how she speaks and even how she intervenes, and you can see that she is really into her subject and that she understands a lot and that she has really a lot of experience. And I really liked how she handled if there was something that was more difficult. For example, if there was a delegate that couldn't agree on a point or on a sentence, and she was really good to move forward, but without being too strict. But she had her point, so it's not that she was accepting everything that was said, but she I think she did a great job. And there are other ones like the delegates from Ukraine, Svetlana. I also like that she participated even when the situation was difficult.
Mm-hmm.
So I think for role models would be Elizabeth Bush and Svetlana from Ukraine.
Okay, so I invite people to look through it. And in order to finish, like because like we're already over the 1 hour, it goes so fast. But I read more and more. So this is really this is like if you read the report, it's very scientific. Again, every assessment is every statement is assessed by a notation being like we are very confident, we are relatively confident, and like so you can grade how sure the people are when they are stating something within the report. And some things like it's clear that we don't know so much about, so we can guess, but it's not sure. Some things like we are almost 100% sure, like because there is nothing like 100 in science. But so you read that, and then you read the first report and then the second report, even though the third one is about mitigation and it shows that there is a chance. Like you have something in hand that says that we need to take drastic measures, that we need to take them now, and having the feeling that nobody's listening because like when you release the report, Lionel Messi is moving to Paris Saint-Germain, everybody's talking about that instead of talking about the report, a true story. I know you probably remember that pretty well. And then like the third report comes and unfortunately there is war in Ukraine, so like the titles are not there and there is something happening with whatever stars on for show business or whatever. How frustrating it is first, and this emotional aspect of urgency and of kind of catastrophe if we don't do anything. How do you balance that when you need to produce a scientific work? Like people would tend to think that you might be massively biased, right?
Well, I mean, I have to say, as I'm also in the field already now for some time, I must say that, however, at least here in Luxembourg, my feeling is that the reception of the reports, of the IPCC reports, has increased over time.
Mm-hmm.
I think because I was already involved in the fourth assessment report at that time as member of the Belgian delegation, and I remember that when I came home, I was really frustrated that basically nobody in Luxembourg was talking about this report. It became a bit better with the fifth report, but I think really now the sixth report what at least my personal feeling is that it was most represented in the media, although I agree with you that other topics were overshading it. For Ukraine war, it's fully understandable. For other topics, maybe not so much, but it is to a certain extent correct. But I also think that, I mean, from my personal point of view, what makes me personally quite optimistic is that at the international level, actually, since the adoption of the Paris Agreement, things are changing quite fast, actually, considering the system we are in. We are in the UN system. It is a difficult system, but actually things are changing quite fast there. And if I look back at Glasgow, we had in this cover decision, which is the main political decision, we had a whole section on science and urgency, which was never seen before. And also having a phrase in there which says that we have to reduce CO2 emission by 45% compared to 2010, which was verbatim taken out of the 1.5 special report of the Ipcc. That's something we have never seen before, and it even was talking about the coal phase out and then the fossil fuel phase down, which was only phase down, which was also created a lot of discussions. But that all countries in the world, because all countries in the world are represented in the UNFCCC, and they all agreed to this particular document, are agreeing to this. For me, that's actually a very big step forward. Of course, we have to be realistic and say this is only on paper. It's not action that is taking on the ground, but still, it's important to have this kind of statements already on paper, because then it will be more easy to implement them on a national basis, if of course the governments in the respective countries want to do it. That's a big question, of course. However, having them on paper also gives the opportunity for civil society, like for example the Youth for Climate, which are doing an amazing job in that field, but also other civil societies, in order to give them a lever actually to push, to say, listen, you agreed to this, now it's time to act. And that's, in my opinion, something that really changed since 2015, when the Paris Agreement was agreed, and it really there was really a big push since then, and very big dynamics in the policy fields on this topic.
But I think if you look at the history of all the research in terms of Ipcc and then COP21 to 20, anyway, you see that there was also a huge evolution on your side, guys, because like at the beginning it was like, you need to do that, you need to do that, you need to do that, and nobody was listening. And it switched to what can you do? Let's analyze that. What are your questions? We are going to answer that. And since you switch to that approach, then the countries and the international scene is listening much more to what you say. And like probably are more people working on the subject as well, because like it's becoming really a thing with time, and more and more research are coming. And the model is actually finer. Like remember, like 20 years ago, I'm talking about maybe 15 years ago, like people were talking about climate change like 2300, right? And now, like by retuning the model and then like having more people doing research, now we are not 2300 but 2030, right? In terms of horizon. So at least it's moving, but like just a personal note, thank you for that, because like we also see that you guys learn so much and then manage to switch the things so like people can take it into consideration, can get informed with it. The report is readable. Of course, it's not an easy one to read, but it is readable. I made it. I'm still alive. So it's just like some thank you from this random guy who was not involved with the redaction, but like I actually considered like reading it at some point. Just a last one question for you guys. If you had one advice to give to our young researchers, like for the future, or like something general, like one advice, what would you say?
Well, my advice would be at first to read the report and to women to to join the IPCC process? Because we're not at 50%. It would be nice to have a balance between women and men for the IPCC.
I have a good point for you, Dana. You might not know, but like the Jonk Fuerscher Contest exists like for its 51st edition. And during, I think we looked with my colleague for the 21st edition, we had like during 20 years, 3 women applying to the contests. And on the last edition, we had more women than men. So at least with the Jonk Fuerscher Contest, we are going in the right direction.
I think it's nice that women are encouraged to participate more in scientific processes.
And we are really happy to welcome them here. And Andrew, your piece of advice?
Yeah, no, I can only join Dana. Maybe I make then the call a bit broader to encourage everybody to get into this topic. At least for me, it's a very important topic that we all need to solve together, and we need the best scientific basis to do it. The better the scientific basis is the better actions we can take. So I can only encourage everybody, especially young women, but everybody to join this endeavor. And as I also said in my keynote during the Jonk Fuerscher Contest, actually everybody, every field of science can contribute to the solution. And that's, I think, important. So it doesn't really matter on the field of science, but everybody can contribute.
Finance, economics, social as well, that plays a
even laws,
part.
Even laws. We even need lawyers today.
Exactly, yeah. Those people play a huge part in the last report. I encourage them to check as well. I'm going to put a link to the report in the comments or in the description of the video. If you're familiar with YouTube, you might know that this is the point where we need to tell the people that if they were interested in that content, they should definitely subscribe or leave a thumb up. I honestly, I haven't thought I would say that something like that on cam one day, but the time has come. And many thanks for your time. Many thanks for your explanation. I hope people like the format, which is a bit more informal, and then we answer like to many different types of questions. But the topic is so broad that one, we don't have the time to answer all those questions because like it would last forever. Read the reports, and second, that you answered brilliantly to all the traps that I posed as a devil's advocate here on the side. So thank you a lot for dodging my questions, and doing it a brilliant way. Thank you, and hope to see you soon then.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you for organizing. It was really a pleasure from our side.
Thanks a lot. Take care and see you soon. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.